I try to imagine tending my child with no medicine as 78% of her body and 90% of her brain become water deliberately defiled by Americans' leaders. I try to imagine myself having nothing with which to cool her but cloths dampened with ruined water. I try to imagine singing to her inert body, then putting away forever her abandoned clothes, toys, shoes, as I try in the name of the compassionate, the merciful, to forgive her killers. My mind balks. What is a terrorist but an inflictor of pain and terror? Madeleine Albright and Colin Powell, in the interests of our defense, again and again agree that the sanctions are working and that the cost is, quote, worth it. 1.25 billion Muslims know this. Some are insane with rage as a result. And 5,000 more infants and children will die this month for the crime of being born to mothers who have done nothing but suffer under the rule of an Iraqi leader whom the U.S. empowered in the first place. We're going to be hearing some pretty grim facts tonight, and I feel moved to remind us that something remarkable is underway right now in the world. People in unprecedented numbers are pouring into the streets to say no to this war before it starts. And it's unprecedented because it's happening before the war starts. Today, the front page of the Washington Post, the mainstream media, which has all but been overlooking this phenomenon, okay? The front page of the Washington Post today ran a very long story about the burgeoning anti-war movement in the United States. It spoke about the National Council of Churches planning massive civil disobedience in response to this. That's tremendously hopeful to me. I hope you take some hope in that as well. The Missoulian reported today that ACLU has seen a huge increase in its membership since September 11th. Henry Hyde has become a card-carrying member of the ACLU. This is what's going on in our country right now, is cutting across the old political dividing lines. People get it. People are getting it, that what's going on cannot be tolerated. So I think we need to take justified solace in that, at least the kind that will help us to keep moving and not be paralyzed but by the sometimes daunting statistics that we are facing on a daily basis in stories. Thomas Nagy is an internationally respected Washington, D.C. scholar who's an associate professor of expert systems in the George Washington University School of Business and Public Management. We've spoken already of the article that was published and brought his work to prominence. It was called "The Secret Behind the Sanctions: How the U.S. Intentionally Destroyed Iraq's Water Supply." It was published in the Progressive magazine, September 2001. Naji's article shows that there were extremely serious and still deadly U.S. violations of international law and human rights in U.S. Defense Department planning for the 1991 U.S. war against Iraq and in the implementation of the sanctions against Iraq. He's a member of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, a presenter at the 1999 and 2001 DoD's Joint Services Conference on Professional Ethics. Naji is a scholar and knowledgeable peace advocate who speaks out on the issues related to war with Iraq as a parent, ex-refugee, and college professor who did his postdoctoral work in public health at the Johns Hopkins University and as former research director with the American Bar Association. Tom was part of a fact-finding delegation that visited Iraq this past September and October at the behest of the Canadian affiliate of the Nobel Prize. Was it the Doctors Beyond Borders?
It's the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War.
Okay. In an effort to estimate civilian fatalities in the event of another full-scale war in Iraq, that was the purpose of that visit. He is undertaking his Montana Peace Seekers Network speaking tour in the hope that if the information he has discovered is known, it may help to save the lives of thousands and thousands of innocent Iraqi children and their families in the time ahead. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Naji.
When I have given a version of this speech twice to the Department of Defense, once in a preliminary fashion, and the second time I organized a two-person panel on this topic of the deliberate and continued destruction and degradation of the Iraqi water system and its devastating human consequences. I did something that I've never done before, which is to say, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I leave this conference humiliated with egg on my face, because if I'm wrong and I have egg on my face, I can live with that, and I can sleep well tonight. But if I'm right, then this is extremely dire, because what I am raising are questions of the intentional, gravest possible violations of Geneva, and indeed the possibility of even a breach of the International Convention Against Genocide. Whenever a scientist makes a claim, if it is a very major claim, it is the scientist's responsibility, in my opinion, to go to the most critical audiences possible and seek refutation. Is it possible that I've overlooked some plausible explanation? Is it possible that I'm wrong? So when the Department of Defense, this is DoD, all the uniformed branches of the military and NATO, became quite angry, but they had no refutation. I then went to another very critical audience. In last summer, the Association of Genocide Scholars. And I said to them the same thing. I said, I am here to raise the prospect and the belief that the United States has crossed the boundary into genocide, and the genocide continues to the present day. I'm very uncomfortable saying this, because it is the gravest possible accusation that can be made against the country. And this is my country. And I said, if I am mistaken, the same thing, then I want a refutation. One professor stepped forward, and it was a professor from Harvard who handed me a very thin envelope. And she said, you're wrong. So I looked at it with rather eager anticipation and found nothing but some clippings from the New York Times. And I said, I'm sorry. That's not meaningful refutation. Primary source documents are meaningful refutation, but not anybody can clip articles out of the New York Times. So then finally I went to the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, which awards the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology, which is about the most critical medical audience I could find on the planet, and said the same thing. And I found not refutation, but strong support from everyone in the room except one. Now, let's look at the problem. The sanctions on Iraq, principally by, first there was a bombing that destroyed the electrical system and several of the water and sanitation systems. But what really destroyed the capacity to produce pure water was the fact that sewage and water treatment is absolutely dependent on a steady flow of electricity. In addition to that, I mean, that wasn't enough. Then the U.S. kept the system degraded for the past, ever since 1991, with the judicious and deliberate and intentional use of economic sanctions. Before I go into the evidence, and I have some evidence to present tonight that I found recently, more recently than the article, and I think in the Progressive, and I think which shows almost what amounts to an absolute confession by the Air Force. And before I go any further, let me ask you to assume that I'm a traitor or I'm insane. And I will ask you to look up the evidence that I cite. I don't have a deep throat like the famous television or movie, about the Nixon scandal. What I have instead are partially declassified documents that you can go to the website of the U.S. Department of Defense, and I have articles from the strategic attack doctrine from the Air Force, which was never classified, and you can go to their website and download yourself and see if I am taking sections out of context, if I'm over-interpreting the data. Now, let's begin with a very brave member of the military in civilian clothes at the time, the second Mueller, writing in the most elite mainstream journal of its type, Foreign Policy, in 1999. He and the other Mueller, I believe his father at University of Rochester, added up all of the deaths from military action uses of the classic weapons of mass destruction. Poison gas in World War I, atomic bombs in World War III, chemical agents used against the Kurds by the government in Baghdad, the entire gamut. And what they discovered is that far more people have been killed by the U.S. using sanctions against Iraq by these sanctions, which are not called weapons of mass destruction, than all the weapons of mass destruction that you hear about constantly day in and day out. Now that should give us some pause to begin with. At one level, conceptually, this is very, very simple. A girl at an open sewer and gastroenteritis. Bring the screen down. I don't know how to do that. If you can, that'd be wonderful. Thank you. If a water system is destroyed and not rebuilt, then you're going to have an epidemic of waterborne diseases, which is going to kill primarily the very young, the very old, and the ill. Now, the mystery is the Great War against Iraq occurred in 1991. How is it that the leading source of death there's an epidemic, a continued epidemic which has raged since 1991. The leading cause of death of children under the age of 5 continues to be waterborne diseases. How can that be? And I'll raise immediately the question of the gravest. One hypothesis is it's deliberate and intentional and the gravest continuous breach of the Geneva Convention, and indeed crosses the line into genocide. So again, if you'll bear with me 1 second and then we go to the evidence. We look at the Geneva Convention, Protocol Additional 1, which of 1977 went into force in 1979. The United States has signed this but not ratified it. However, 150 countries have signed and ratified this. And under international law, it is undisputed that the United States is legally bound to observe this protocol. Section 2 of Article 54 of this, which the United States is legally bound to observe, says very explicitly, it is prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. And if you read a bit further, it says explicitly that among the items that are indispensable to the survival of the civilian population and which may never be attacked or rendered useless, you'll see water installations and supplies, specifically and explicitly enumerated. Now you look at the United Nations Genocide Convention, went into force in 1951, which astonishingly, it took the United States almost 40 years before it ratified it. And in the ratification papers, the United States is denounced by fully half the NATO allies. Because what the United States did, when after 40 years it ratified it only with the proviso that the United States can be charged with the crime of genocide only if the United States allows itself to be charged with the crime of genocide. So that's the reaction of half the NATO members. They laughed and they also raged and said that by God, you're gutting the treaty. But you'll notice people commonly misunderstand genocide, but the legal definition, the part that's especially relevant to us, is Article 2. Genocide can be committed by any of 5 different ways. Either all 5 or any of the 5 constitute genocide. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group. But I would direct your attention particularly to item C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now we finally get to the evidence. But I felt that it was necessary to lay this groundwork. And since I promised no more preliminaries, for once I'll keep my promise. And we'll hold off on the definition of terrorism and also the sources. So here is the evidence. Whoops. What am I doing? Sources again. Okay. Finally, a surprising confession. If I make the accusation or allegation for the government of Iraq, then you have good reason to have skepticism. But please note this paragraph. The electrical attacks, referring to the 1991 Desert Storm, proved extremely effective. The loss of electricity shut down the capital's water treatment plants, Baghdad, and led to a public health crisis from raw sewage dumped into the Tigris River. In the following week, Tomahawk land attack missiles and coalition aircraft reduced every major city in Iraq to the same unhappy condition. First of all, what is this quote from? The quote is from a R.G. Davis, Decisive for Strategic Bombing in the Gulf War, published in Washington, D.C. by the U.S. Air Force History and Museums Program in 1996. But what is, to me, compelling evidence of admission of guilt, but wrapped into something else, is the fact that this quote appears at the top of page 26 of the U.S. Air Force Doctrine Document 2-1.2, dated May of 1998. Now, there are a couple of possibilities that would save the day. And we could interpret this in such a way that this would not be minimally the gravest continuing violation of the Geneva Convention, and possibly even genocide itself. One possibility which has to be rejected is that the document refers to unhappy public health crisis. And the possibility is that what precedes it is a declaration that yes, we did destroy the electrical system on which pure water depended. However, we condemn this, and as official Air Force doctrine, we put all Air Force members on alert that this is a grave crime never to be repeated. However, I would urge you to go to your computers, download the document, and what you'll find is, instead of the sternest possible warning that we must never do this again, it's actually under the heading of elements of effective operations. Now, I've been speaking English for 50 years, and I'm not a native speaker of English, but I can't see how to call that elements of effective operations is a warning, a dire warning, to say we must never, never repeat this atrocity. I view this, to call this elements of effective operations, a clear directive to the top command of the Air Force that this is the proper way to fight an air war. Now there's another, and I can leave it to you to judge how this can be reconciled to what the Air Force calls the law of air conflict and what we commonly call the Geneva Conventions. Now, there's another possibility that would save the day. I allege that this is a confession. This is tantamount to an explicit confession of having committed genocide, perhaps, but definitely and minimally of having breached the Geneva Convention in the gravest possible fashion. Except there's one other out that occurs to me, and you might think of some other out. And that is, the document says, it doesn't say that it created a catastrophic public health crisis. It uses the word unhappy. So let's see what the Air Force thinks is unhappy. Is it a catastrophe? You judge. Well, you don't have to use indirect evidence, and you don't have to extrapolate. You can go to the May 2001 issue of Air and Space Power Chronicles. You can look it up on the internet and find the article by Major, now Lieutenant Colonel Reiser. This is a very well-educated man. He went to his service academy at Colorado Springs, did graduate work in Stockholm, and this, I believe, I know that he, in his bio, he speaks about going to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. So this is a very well-educated lieutenant colonel. And what he says is, he says that the unhappy episode of bombing the electrical power and reducing every major city in Iraq to the unhappy situation, he calls it a gray area in terms of law, ethics, morality. Furthermore, he says, while crippling Iraq's military and command and control capability, destruction of these facilities shut down water purification and sewage treatment plants. As a result, epidemics of gastroenteritis, cholera, and typhoid broke out, leading perhaps to as many as 100,000 civilian deaths and a doubling of the infant mortality rate. Well, you tell me, is that unhappy or is that catastrophic and criminal? I think that maybe my English isn't sufficient, but I think any common sense interpretation would call this not unhappy, but absolutely catastrophic. And yet he says in his article, and I ask you, since I only quote short excerpts from Reiser, to go to the article, read the article. It's only about 9 or 10 pages, and see if I'm quoting him out of context. He goes on to say that this action was legal, ethical, and he finally moves it out of the gray area, says it was in accordance to Air Force doctrine. He also says something that is unbelievably sad and tragic. Note that he wrote this in May of 2001. He says that thanks to the miracle of precision-guided munitions, only 3,000 civilian Iraqis were killed directly by bombs. Now bear in mind that a couple of months later, no one would dare say only 2,081 New York civilians died with the miracle of in a precision fashion, driving an airplane deliberately into one of the trade towers and then into the second, and saying this is some sort of miracle of precision. But the way that Reiser gets around the 100,000 civilian deaths, as he says, they're indirect. So does that mean, now they are indirect, but does that mean that if I shoot you, I've committed deliberate murder? But if you, as I'm wrapped up in my lecture, you put poison in this coffee, that doesn't kill me immediately. It's not a fast-acting super poison. It takes 48, maybe 96 hours to kill me. Then will you plead that you only killed me indirectly, even though it was highly predictable and inevitable that I die? Will any jury in the land, buy this kind of argument that Lieutenant Colonel Reiser brings forth? The third element in Reiser's article that I find deeply disturbing is that he says it is doctrine, Air Force official doctrine, it is legal and it is ethical to bomb civilian areas, to bomb countries in the hope of degrading civilian morale, okay? As long as you don't kill the civilians directly. Indirect deaths don't count, no matter what the number. I move to the logical conclusion. And that seems to be absolute rubbish and totally indefensible. Now, in fairness, I want to say the first document is the official U.S. Air Force current strategic attack document, signed off by General Keyes, by order of the Secretary of the Air Force. Colonel Reiser's article has at the end the disclaimer. This isn't necessarily the official view of the U.S. Air Force or the Department of Defense, but I'd like you to do a thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this. It's Russell's rotation of nouns for you logic majors in the audience. Suppose that we found a statement from a lieutenant colonel in the Iraqi Air Force who calls for and defends the killing of 100,000 American civilians and says it's okay provided it was indirect. That is, it might be inevitable, it might be totally predictable, but they didn't die immediately after our action. Would anybody let the Iraqis off the hook if it described in great detail an operation that would cause 100,000 deaths of American civilians, and then at the end it would say, this is not necessarily the official view of the Iraqi Air Force, the Iraqi Department of Defense, or the government of Iraq? I don't think so. I think it would be regarded as weasel words that mean nothing, and the only debate would be saturation bombing or a nuclear attack upon Iraq. Now I have some key questions for General Keyes, who was the commander of the doctrine, of Air Force doctrine, and who signed document 2-1.2. And I have a question for Colonel Reiser. How many civilians do you have to slaughter? With what degree of directness or indirectness before you're willing to characterize the action as terrorism or even genocide, rather than effective or unhappy? Now, another question is that bothers me deeply from the work I do, the other side of my head, the non-business side and the non-computer technology side in public health, is to ask the question, did the Defense Intelligence Agency deliberately reverse engineer public health? Public health is the branch of medicine that seeks to save lives of groups of people, as contrasted to ordinary medicine where I go and present my body to a doctor and say, here are my signs and symptoms, can you cure me? In public health, you're trying to save the greatest number of lives of entire populations. And the question is, did the Defense Intelligence Agency deliberately reverse engineer public health in order to change its role from saving lives to taking innocent lives? Previously, up to now, I've been talking about the bombing in 1991, and I raised the issue, were the deaths unforeseen, unforeseeable, and innocent and unhappy, or were they foreseeable in crimes? Now I raise a different question. How can it be that this crime is ongoing? In 1991, the Defense Intelligence Agency of the Department of Defense published a document called Iraq Water Treatment Vulnerabilities. Only it wasn't declassified until 1995. I didn't discover it till about 1998. This document I found unbelievable, and that's what I wrote about in the progressive and the successor documents. The essence of it is that it doesn't even talk, at least in the declassified portion, that finally we American citizens are permitted to see and members of Congress are permitted to see. It doesn't even talk about bombing. What it says is the entire water system of Iraq can be utterly degraded within 6 months by withholding through economic sanctions a very small number of chemicals and items of equipment. When I saw this, I thought at first it had to be a hoax, so I called the Department of Defense. They said it's authentic, it's ours. So then I posted it to the Department of Defense JSCO, Joint Services Conference on Professional Ethics, listserv. And almost everybody there is a uniformed officer in the U.S. military. And I said, this looks like a document that has no right to exist in a democracy. Because not only does it show how to absolutely destroy the water supply of an entire country, but it shows how to keep it destroyed for as long as the United States wishes. Further, it goes into scientific detail about the possible countermeasures that Iraq could take. And it explains in detail why no countermeasure could possibly work. Could they use rainwater? No, not enough rain. Could they dig wells? No, the water table and the level of salinity is too high. The hydrology is all wrong. Could they ship water from the northern part of Iraq, which is relatively pure? No, absolutely impossible. They don't have enough pipes, they don't have pumps, so forth. So I said, gentlemen and ladies, this looks like a horror show. Is there any benign interpretation? And the most interesting explanation that I heard, and which, if it's true, saves the day, at least with respect to the sanctions and the continuing deaths, is maybe this document was sent to all the major commands of the U.S. military and the British as well, perhaps to say, my God, whatever you do, we must not block these or interfere with the flow of this equipment and these chemicals. Otherwise, we cause mass death, particularly of infants. Because the document also goes into detail about who's going to die and by what disease. So then I looked for evidence. Is this an early draft of a plan that has stayed in effect all these years? Well, I give you two pieces of evidence and ask you to decide. Piece number one. Representative Tony Hall, Democrat of Ohio, went to Iraq in the year 2000, and he conferred with members of the United Nations, the civil engineers who have been there for years. And But before he did that, he talked to the statistical people and established that there is a continuing raging epidemic of waterborne disease deaths of children under 5. Indeed, it's the leading cause of death and continues to be all these years. Then he went to the engineers to say, my God, what's needed in order to stop this raging epidemic of children under 5? Surely we don't make war against children. So what they told him is that there are 18 contracts that are on hold. That is, they're blocked by permanent members of the Security Council that are indispensable for the rehabilitation of the water system. 17 of those blocks or holds or delays are done by the United States of America. One is by the only other country that casts its veto among the permanent 5 in the Security Council. And what country might that be?
UK.
The UK. It's a puppy dog that has a strange bark. Blair, Blair. So when Hall comes back to Washington, he writes a letter to then Secretary of State Albright, and he begs her to lift the blocks, the holds. Because you see, what happens is Iraq is permitted to sell its own oil, but it doesn't see any of the money. It all goes to a bank in New York. Until recently, it was the Bank of Paris, or the Bank of France in New York. It may have recently changed to some other bank. And then Iraq is permitted to propose how this money might be spent on food, on medicine, and on things like water rehabilitation. Any member of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, for any reason whatsoever, or for no reason, can delay or can veto any item. And there is no appeal. There doesn't have to be any explanation. This is a very bizarre process. And I would say criminal. So here we have Tony Hall saying this is what's needed. If my recollection serves, Albright didn't even bother to answer Hall's letter. I don't think there's any record that she even bothered to say no. I mean, it just wasn't important enough, I guess. Now, the second piece of evidence that I would ask you to consider, so that first piece of evidence looks to me very much like Iraq water treatment vulnerabilities or some update has been followed all these years. The second piece of evidence is that you can verify, of course you can verify Tony Hall's letter to Albright, that's a public document. But also, the second piece of document, you go to the Office of Iraq Program at the UN. And they're pretty close-lipped, but they do let out some statistics. And in the year 2000, they disclosed the fact that this oil for food scheme, this bizarre scheme, had been going for little more than 4 years. The government of Iraq had asked that over $1 billion of their own money generated by the sales of their oil be used to rehabilitate the water and sanitation system. The amount of rehabilitation contracts and chemicals that was allowed by the U.S. in the year 2000, from 1966, when oil for food began, to the year 2000, was $160 million, which comes down roughly to $2 per Iraqi per year. And this for a ruined system. I don't think it's conceivable that any country could produce sufficient clean water for its population at the expenditure of $2 per human being per year, even if its system had never been destroyed. So those are the two pieces of evidence that trouble me deeply. And I cannot see an alternative. And I have not heard from three very critical audiences, the most critical I could find in medicine, in genocide studies, and the Department of Defense, a meaningful refutation to my interpretation that indeed this crime has happened and it's ongoing. Now, let's bring this up to the present day. My grave concern is that irrespective of what is coming out of the government, there has not been a revocation of strategic attack doctrine document 2-1.2. And that suggests to me, on a very common sense level, that irrespective of what the government says, and what's leaked and what's not leaked, that the next war will be fought like the previous war. Only this time, my findings and the findings of other people, and common sense tells you that if there is a repetition of this style of fighting, that far more than 100,000 people will die indirectly. And the reason is obvious. The Iraqis, the health of the Iraqis is so much worse now than it was in 1991. The spare parts are gone. They've cannibalized everything they could cannibalize. The hospital, the medical system is in shambles. It used to be at the level of a poorer Western European country in terms of literacy, in terms of health care, in terms of all the measures that we use in public health to assess the health or illness of a population. Now, let me raise one thing which is truly makes it somewhat complex, but I think for this audience, it's not going to be anything overwhelming. In the matter of civil rights, of human rights, the government of Iraq's actions have been downright brutal, okay? It has not respected, in fact, it has gravely violated the civil rights of people. However, the government of Iraq is not like the usual kind of dictatorship that the government in Washington backs, because it has invested tremendous amounts of money when it had control over its own oil on education, on health care, on transportation, on all the basic infrastructure. And that's why it was a model of development. That's why the status of women was phenomenal in comparison to the rest of the region and began to approach that of a Western European country. That's why even when it was fighting this incredible protracted war against Iran on behalf of the United States and on behalf of the West and on behalf of the oil sheikhdom, even while perhaps 800,000 of its troops died in the battles, the health indicators such as maternal mortality, infant mortality, under 5 mortality continued to decline. Okay? So we have something more than absolutely simple to contend with, but it's hardly overwhelmingly complex. My role, as I see it, And I guess I went to Iraq for a couple of other reasons. One was, at first it seemed suicidal, and I was very scared to go, terrified to go. But then after I read Nagler's book, it only seemed very risky, and I made myself go. I decided it was better not to die, of shame by not going. I'm a timid person, to tell you the truth, and it was hard to get on the plane. But an incredible event has occurred. The usual suspects, the Mennonites, the Church of the Brethren, the Quakers, the Voices in the Wilderness, have decided to send elderly, volunteer, old pacifists like me to Iraq to spend some time at Article 54 infrastructure in the hope that the United States would not attack and bomb its own citizens or citizens from other countries. And as older people, it would be hard for any spin machine to depict us as warriors trying to kill American flyers. Okay, so I spent some time in a water sanitation system, partly to understand the status, partly to be physically present. Okay, now what's fascinating to me is what I don't know and what the vast majority of people don't know, and what is in Nagler's book, but which can be confirmed by going to your library. It turns out this has been tried once before with spectacular success in the case of the United States sending a puppet army called the Contras to destroy soft targets, i.e., very specifically educational centers and medical treatment centers, and to burn these centers to torture and kill the educational workers or the health workers. Now, the former prime minister of the Sandinista government was in Berkeley, and he was being translated to an audience. And he said, what the translator said was, now he is saying that despite so many of these so-called soft targets being destroyed, very few were attacked even, if there was a single international observer present. And the former foreign minister jumped up and he said, no, wrong. And he said very excitedly to the translator, tell them not a single educational center or a single medical treatment center was attacked by the Contras if there was so much as one international observer there. And that dropped my anxiety level at least a tiny bit. But I needed every bit of help I could. The third reason, and I hope that you can give me some help here, and I believe that David Duncan's work is an example, but we need more of it. It's so easy to arouse your rage. I can slap you, I can insult you, I can spit on you. But the question I have is, how can we arouse the compassion of the 99% of the American people, including the military, that does not want to hurt children? And I think that a prayer for children of water has been the most successful instance that I've seen. Now, what I am trying to do, and hopefully somebody can suggest other techniques and better techniques. The third reason I went to Iraq was to see for myself and to gather primary data to develop a simulation. And I'm trying to build a simulation in which a computer simulation to be distributed free on the internet, in which your role is that of a parent, perhaps an Iraqi parent, trying to keep their children alive when the water stops flowing. And when what water you can get is deadly contaminated. And when you try to boil the water, but you find quickly boiling water means less water, and you have so little water that you can get. And when you find that the bombing has destroyed the normal ways of cooking, and so you chop down trees. And when I was in Iraq, I saw an awful lot of tree stumps. I didn't see that many trees that they can use to burn to boil the water. And I think if Americans can put themselves into the shoes of an Iraqi parent, and they can go through the stages of keeping the child alive, and what if the child develops the first symptoms of cholera? Then what do? You can't go to the hospital is gone. They couldn't diagnose, they don't have, it's just a horrendous situation. And empirically, it's the same way. As much as the Iraqi people have suffered in terms of civil rights and civil liberties under the government of Iraq, how could anyone believe that they will welcome the American troops and the bombers as their liberators? I had a reporter tell me that he had the bizarre experience of going from 2 weeks on the ground in Iraq. We bomb Iraq every other day. And he goes from Iraq straight to an aircraft carrier that's doing some of the bombing. He's welcomed aboard by the skipper. And the skipper says, "Oh, let's have a conversation, and oh, sure, you can tape record it." And he says, "Before you ask me any questions, I want you to tell me how much do the Iraqi people, not the government of Iraq, but how much do the Iraqi people appreciate what we're doing for them by bombing them?" And the reporter, his jaw hits the ground, and when it rebounds and connects up to the rest of his head, says, "Admiral or Captain or whatever, I got to tell you, the people of Iraq are in shock, they're in ruins. They don't understand why we're adding to their misery." He says the Admiral was absolutely crestfallen and just silently turned off the tape recorder and just, he didn't gloat, he wasn't happy. He actually believed this, And this is where I think 99% of people can be reached, but it needs your participation, in order to, and everybody putting their minds and hearts and pens and feet together to make this happen.